Hello everybody, welcome back to Book of Kings, where we discuss topics such as history, religion, philosophy, psychology, culture, and more, and the way that they all interact with one another. Don't forget to like, leave a comment, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to receive a notification every time I release a new video. Hope you enjoy. When talking about modern intractable conflicts, there was one conflict which likely comes to mind more than any other as being unparalleled with regard to its length as well as its level of controversy and divisiveness, and that is the Israel Palestine conflict. However, in order to thoroughly understand the conflict, one must understand its origins. In the late 1800s, the modern Zionist movement would initiate the organized migration of Jews to the Ottoman region of Palestine with the objective of establishing a Jewish state. Upon the outbreak of World War I, the British would convince the Arabs of the Ottoman Empire to rise up in revolt in exchange for British support for Arab independence. However, the British would soon after establish conflicting agreements, first with France to divide Ottoman territories amongst themselves, and then with Zionist leaders to establish a Jewish homeland in the region of Palestine. The British would govern Palestine under the Mandate system and would permit increased Jewish migration to the region, resulting in hostilities with its local Arab inhabitants. This would culminate in the United Nations voting to partition the territory into separate Jewish and Arab states, ultimately resulting in the outbreak of civil war in the region. Toward the end of the Civil War phase of the conflict, Zionist forces would militarily conquer the territory set aside by the UN partition plan for the future Jewish state, in addition to territories set aside for a future Arab state. 250,000 to 500,000 Palestinians would flee or be expelled during the Civil War stage of the war. The British would terminate their mandate on May 15, 1948, and on that day, David Ben-Gurion, head of the Jewish Agency, would declare a Jewish state and issue the Israeli Declaration of Independence, forming the State of Israel. Following the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel, the Civil War would transform into a conflict between Israel and Arab states, referred to as the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, with the Arab League declaring the objective of restoring order and preventing additional bloodshed, and the armies of Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, and Iraq, as well as contingents from Yemen, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, and Sudan entering the newly formed State of Israel, where they would take control of Arab territories and attack Israeli forces as well as various Jewish settlements. Following a year of conflict, a ceasefire would be declared and the war would end. The State of Israel would control the area that the UN partition plan had set aside for the Jewish state, as well as more than half of the area set aside for the proposed Arab state, in addition to West Jerusalem, which per the partition plan was meant to be an international zone. Transjordan would gain control of what would become known as the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and Egypt would gain control of what would become the Gaza Strip, proclaiming the All-Palestine Protectorate, which would claim nominal authority over all of the former Mandate of Palestine and would be recognized by 6 of the then 7 members of the Arab League, with the exception of Transjordan, but would de facto be under Egyptian military occupation. The following year, during the Jericho Conference in December 1948, hundreds of Palestinian notables would assemble and accept Transjordanian rule and recognize the authority of Transjordanian King Abdullah, with the West Bank being formally annexed on April 24, 1950, and Transjordan officially becoming Jordan, being that it now ruled over both sides of the Jordan River. Jordan would provide full citizenship to the West Bank's 420,000 local inhabitants, as well as 280,000 refugees in the West Bank and 70,000 refugees on the East Bank of the Jordan River, tripling the population of Jordan. Palestinians would additionally be given half of the seats in the Jordanian parliament. While the annexation was recognized by the United Kingdom, the United States, and Iraq, it was generally considered illegal by the international community, and the Arab League would determine that the West Bank was being held in trust until the situation in Palestine could be resolved. Per the ceasefire which ended the Arab-Israeli War, boundaries between what became the State of Israel, its neighbors, and the Palestinian territories, which would come to be referred to as the Green Line, would be established with the 1949 armistice agreements between Israel and neighboring Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, and would serve as the de facto borders of the State of Israel from 1949 until 1967, and would be the internationally recognized borders between Israel and the Palestinian territories to this day, known as 1967 borders. At the insistence of Arab nations, the armistice agreements made clear that permanent boundaries were not being created, and that said boundaries did not imply an ultimate settlement to the issue of Palestine. Additionally, following the armistice agreements, a series of laws would be passed by Israel preventing displaced Palestinians from claiming private property lost or returning to their former homes in the now state of Israel. By the end of hostilities, 700,000 to 800,000 Palestinians, roughly half of mandatory Palestine's Arab population, and 85% of the population of the territory that Israeli forces had captured, would be expelled or flee. Between 400 and 600 villages would be destroyed or depopulated, and hundreds of civilians and unarmed soldiers would be killed in an event known as the Nakba, which translates in Arabic as catastrophe. 200,000 of those displaced would take refuge in the Gaza Strip, resulting in a drastic increase in population density and a decrease in the standard of living of the local population. Roughly 150,000 Arabs in the territory captured by Israel would remain and become Arab citizens of Israel. Israel would be accepted into the United Nations as a full member state in May 11, 1949. Following the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, the government of Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion would begin to implement a plan to double the population of Israel in 4 years, including increasing Jewish migration not just from Europe, but also focusing on mass migration from the Middle East and North Africa. By that year, the Jewish population of Israel would number at roughly 700,000, 60,000 of which from families residing in Palestine for centuries. Opponents of the plan would argue that there was not justification for organizing the mass migration of Jews whose lives were not in danger, and that the integration process would place undue hardship on the state. However, the proposal would move forward per the insistence of the Prime Minister. Jews from Arab nations would migrate to Israel based upon a variety of circumstances, with some coming of their own volition to fulfill their aspirations to live in the newly formed Jewish state, and others coming to escape persecution within their home countries. The Jewish population in Israel would increase to 1,400,000, and by 1948 the population would reach 2 million, with approximately 1,150,000 Jewish refugees settling in Israel between 1948 and 1970. The influx of migrants would lead to a period of austerity where food, clothes, and furniture were rationed. In order to meet the economic needs of the state, Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion would sign an agreement with West Germany to receive reparations in 1952 to pay for the cost of resettling Jewish refugees and compensate individual Jews for their losses of livelihood and property due to persecution in Nazi Germany, something which would provoke mass protests by Jews angry that Israel would accept monetary compensation for the Holocaust. In July 1950, Israel would pass the Law of Return, which would give Jews around the world, defined as people with one or more Jewish grandparent, as well as their spouses, the unrestricted right to immigrate to Israel and obtain Israeli citizenship. In the following years, primarily between 1949 and 1956, an armed conflict would ensue between Israel and Palestinian militants, primarily based in the Gaza Strip, known as the Fedayeen, composed of Palestinian refugees driven from their homes in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, who would infiltrate Israel and engage in attacks on Israeli citizens, as well as the Israeli military and border guards, resulting in the deaths of roughly 500 Israelis, half of them civilians. Between 2,700 and 5,000 Palestinian infiltrators would be killed during these years, with the vast majority of Palestinians killed while entering Israeli territory being unarmed and infiltrating the border for economic and social reasons, in addition to those killed in reprisal attacks such as the Kibbutz massacre in 1953. When Israeli forces under future Prime Minister Ariel Sharon would kill 69 Palestinian civilians, 2/3 of them women and children, in response to cross-border raids from the West Bank, which killed an Israeli woman and her 2 children. A fragile peace would be maintained between Israel and the neighboring Arab states until 1956, when Egypt would nationalize the Suez Canal, tighten the blockade of the Straits of Tiran, which provides Israel access to the Red Sea through the Gulf of Aqaba, a blockade which had been in place since the end of the Arab-Israeli War, and when Egypt would sign an agreement with Syria and Jordan, placing Egyptian President Jamal Abdel Nasser at the command of all 3 armies. In response to the aforementioned events, as well as Fedayeen attacks from the Gaza Strip, Israel, France, and the United Kingdom would launch a surprise attack on Egypt on October 29, 1956, crossing into the Sinai region with the United Kingdom and France operating with the objective of regaining control of the Suez Canal in what became known as the Suez Crisis. After 4 months of Israeli occupation of the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula, the war would eventually end with the withdrawal of British, French, and Israeli forces following pressure from the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Nations. However, the Straits of Tiran would remain open to Israel. At an Arab League meeting in Cairo in January 1964, the League would initiate the creation of the Palestinian Liberation Organization as the representatives of the Palestinian people, which would be founded in June of that year with the stated goals of Arab unity and the liberation of Palestine and the objective of quote-unquote armed struggle as the only way to liberate the homeland. Following the Suez Crisis, the UN General Assembly would call for the stationing of UN peacekeeping forces in Egypt and Israel to ensure that all parties would adhere to the 1949 armistice agreements. Egypt would agree to station a UNEF, United Nations Emergency Force, in the Sinai Peninsula. However, Israel would refuse to allow UNEF forces on its territory. A tense peace would ensue for the next 15 years. However, Palestinian militants would continue to engage in attacks against Israel, and the situation would come to a head in 1967. While Egypt and Jordan would refuse to let PLO militants operate on their soil, guerrilla attacks would result in Jordan becoming embroiled in conflicts with Israel, when a mine attack carried out by the PLO from the Jordanian-controlled West Bank village of As-Samu on November 11th would leave 3 Israeli soldiers dead. King Hussein of Jordan would write a letter the next day giving his condolences to Israel, which he cabled to the U.S. ambassador to Israel, who, not viewing the situation as urgent, would leave the letter on his desk over the weekend. The next day, on November 13, 1966, Israeli Defense Forces would attack the village of As-Samu, resulting in the death of 3 Jordanian civilians and 6 soldiers, as well as 54 soldiers and 69 civilians being wounded. Israel would be censored for the attack at the United Nations with Resolution 228, and King Hussein of Jordan would state that an unwritten agreement between Israel and Jordan to uphold the neutrality of the Green Line, which had up to that point been upheld, was broken with the As-Samu raid. Further, Syria would sponsor guerrilla raids by PLO militants in the early 1960s in what would be termed as a People's War of Liberation, with the majority of such raids originating from the Syrian border. In September 1966, then Israeli Chief of Staff and future Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin would state that Israeli responses, quote, should be aimed at those who carry out the attacks and at the regime that supports them, unquote, which would be interpreted by Arab nations as a plan to bring down the government of Syria. In response, Syria would sign a mutual defense agreement with Egypt in November 1966. Additionally, following the peace accord at the end of the 1948 war, demilitarized zones between Israel and Syria would be established. However, Israelis would gradually take control of portions of these zones, evicting Arab villagers and demolishing their homes, as well as regularly moving tractors and equipment, often accompanied by police, into disputed zones. Syria would respond by firing on these advancing convoys, as well as on Israeli settlements in said disputed territory, to which Israel would retaliate with raids, including the use of air power into Syrian territory. According to Israeli Defense Minister at the time, Moshe Daya, Israel had provoked 80% of the border clashes with Syria. Israeli leaders would frequently proclaim that Syria was responsible for the clashes and that Israel may militarily engage the government of Syria. This pattern of exchange would come to a head on April 7, 1967, when, without prior exchange with Syrian forces, Israeli aircrafts would carry out attacks within Syrian territory, with Israeli planes making it as far as Damascus. Syria would respond with heavy shelling of Israeli border settlements, which would progress into a tit-for-tat of border shelling between the two countries and escalate into a full-scale aerial assault over the Golan Heights. The altercation would eventually come to an end with Soviet intervention, with the Soviet Union proclaiming that the mutual defense agreement between Egypt and Syria had been triggered. In May 1967, in response to information from the Soviet Union, later proven to be false, of an Israeli military buildup on the Syrian border, Egypt would begin to amass troops in the Sinai Peninsula on Israel's border on May 14th. On May 16th, Egypt's Secretary of State Ahmed al-Faqih would assure U.S. Representative to Cairo, David Ness, that Egypt would not take the initiative in attacking Israel, but would come to the defense of neighboring Arab countries in the event of a large-scale attack. The situation would continue to escalate, however, with Egypt expelling the UNF peacekeeping force from Gaza and Sinai on May 19, ratcheting up threatening rhetoric such as warning Israel that should conflict arise, Egypt's objective would be to quote-unquote destroy Israel, and threatening to close the Straits of Tiran again, describing such acts as Egypt's duty, as Israeli Prime Minister Levi Eshkol quote-unquote threatened to march on Damascus, occupy Syria, and overthrow the Syrian regime. Israel responded by stating that were Egypt to close the Strait of Tiran, this would be a call to war, with Israeli Prime Minister Eshkol warning that quote-unquote Israel would stop short of nothing to cancel the blockade. Egypt would announce on May 22nd and 23rd, 1967 that the Straits of Tiran would be closed to all Israeli ships, with the stated purpose of defending the rights of the Palestinian people and coming to the aid of Syria, which had been threatened by Israel. Nasser would publicly deny that Egypt would strike first and spoke of the potential for a negotiated peace and compromise regarding the Straits of Tiran if Israel allowed Palestinians driven out in 1948 to return to their homes in Israel. On May 30th, Egypt and Jordan would sign a mutual defense pact, and the next day, Iraqi forces would be deployed in Jordan upon Jordan's initiative. On June 5, 1967, Israel would launch a surprise attack on Egyptian forces and invade the Sinai Peninsula. Syria and Jordan, triggered by their mutual defense agreements, would rush to Egypt's defense and attack Israel, with the addition of Iraqi forces stationed in Jordan. Israel would proceed to defeat the Arab nations in 6 days and would conquer the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, the Golan Heights from Syria, the West Bank from Jordan, as well as annex East Jerusalem, which formed a part of the West Bank, in what would become known as the Six-Day War. This would result in an additional 280,000 to 325,000 Palestinians and 100,000 Syrians being expelled or fleeing from the West Bank and Golan Heights, respectively. Roughly 120,000 to 170,000 of them already refugees who had been driven out of what became Israel in 1948, as well as the destruction of numerous villages and refugee camps in an event referred to by Palestinians as the Nakba, or setback. The Israeli occupation of the West Bank would continue to the present day and would become the longest military occupation in modern history. Conflict between Israel and its Arab neighbors would resume October 6, 1973, when a coalition of Arab states led by Egypt and Syria would launch a surprise attack into the territories conquered by Israel in the Six-Day War, namely the Sinai Peninsula and Golan Heights, on the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur, which would be referred to as the Yom Kippur War. Egypt's objective would be to seize territory in the Sinai Peninsula, which had been under Israeli occupation since 1967, and leverage those gains in order to negotiate the return of all of Sinai to Egypt. The United States would provide military aid to Israel, while the Soviet Union would provide aid to the Arab states. The war would last until October 25th and would end with Israel expelling Egyptian and Syrian forces while having suffered significant casualties, having lost over 2,500 soldiers. Israeli public anger at the failures of the war would force Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir to step down. In 1977, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat would travel to Israel to speak before the Israeli Knesset, being the first Arab leader to do so. The following year in 1978, Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin would sign the Camp David Accords, which would then culminate the following year in 1979 in a peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, where Israel would withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula and agree to negotiations regarding autonomy for Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, in exchange for Egypt recognizing the State of Israel, making Egypt the first Arab nation to do so. Egypt would regain control of the Sinai Peninsula, however Israel would now control all of the former Mandate of Palestine, with the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians themselves only beginning to take shape. Tune in next time to learn more. Thank you for watching. This has been another Book of Kings video. Don't forget to like, leave a comment, subscribe, hit the bell icon to receive a notification every time I release a new video. And if you enjoy Book of Kings content and would like to support the channel, feel free to donate to the Book of Kings Patreon account. Link is provided in the description.